You're welcome.
Welcome to the May 17, 2023 Policy and Personnel Committee meeting. We have a short but exciting agenda this morning. After Shields, I'm going to turn it over to you for the personnel update, and we can dig into the policies.
Very good. So this time of year in May and June is peak hiring season for us as we prepare for next year. So we're in the process of making sure we replace our retirees. And also, now that the budget is approved, hiring those new hires for those positions that are in the budget. So the administrative staff, as building principals and directors are all hard at work doing that right now. And you'll see those recommendations as they come forward on the board agendas in the very near future.
Great.
So the next item on the agenda is the return of a policy that we have spent some time looking at. And I know you were in touch with Mr. Miller, our attorney.
So I spoke to our attorney and I conveyed what I think the committee was feeling about this, which is that this policy is kind of startling when you read it and it makes you think, whoa, what's going on here in Fort Washington? And he confirmed what our administrators have said in public meetings before, which is this is a policy that's required not because of places like Fort Washington, but for different kinds of specialized facilities where there are procedures that need to happen to protect students that might be accidentally violent. And these measures are really in place to make sure that there are requirements on the personnel that deal with that. So that said, I said to Mr. Miller, we understand that, but we feel like it's confusing to people here. And to the extent that policy is meant to convey certainty and be a place that people can look to understand what's going on in the schools, it's confusing. And he said he has a colleague who just started who's working on this stuff and she could strip it down to the bare bones. And I said I thought that what I was getting from the committee was really at the most extreme, what we would actually like is a policy that is a few sentences long that says we will comply with the state's requirements regarding this XYZ reference to whatever site, and either have a citation to what we will be complying with or put it in regulations with an extensive note about why this was required and that it is required. And he said he will speak to her, he's gonna have her redraft for us and send it back to us. And he couldn't have it for today, but he will have it for the June meeting. I think that accurately depicts how the committee was feeling, but I told him really we wanted like stripped down, very strict. So we'll bring it back again in June.
Very good. Thank you. Updates. Thank you, Dr. Miller, for joining us.
I've spoken to Howard also.
Thank you for taking the walk back over for us.
It's some more steps for me.
It's
Thank
okay.
you. All flowing. Exactly. Have a great day. Thank you.
So the next item on the agenda is a work in progress. I think that's very important for the community to know and for the board to know. The Code of Conduct is a living document that can change whenever we see the need to change it. And there's been a lot of work being done behind the scenes, led by Dr. Bernick. I'm going to turn it over to him. But I just want to assure this group that's here today that there's been several different types of constituents involved in the process. And I'll turn it over to you to give them some insight on who those players are, because you've been very inclusive. And I know you're always striving to be even more inclusive as this process unfolds.
Thank you very much. Let me give you some insight to exactly what Dr. Shields was discussing. This project started with a committee of 4 people, 2 administrators and 2 teachers. They spent the bulk of the year reviewing the code and making recommendations. And once they completed their work, I'd seen several of their drafts and provided feedback throughout the year in a number of different areas. So once they completed their work, I reviewed it. A couple of changes that I felt were missing or maybe didn't fit with what we were hoping to achieve. So made some changes there. I then met with Dr. Shields. We reviewed the document together. After meeting with Dr. Shields, I shared the document with Dr. Hines, Dr. Feeney, Dr. Allen, and Kathy Manuel to get their feedback. Every round of feedback, then I would go through a process of entering feedback, making subtle changes here and there that I felt were appropriate for the spirit of the document. After that, I shared the document with Pia Ferrante and Kevin Scully, Virginia McLean, and Pat Baglio to get their feedback. And again, same process. Took in feedback, made changes where necessary. Lots of questions emerged more than anything. Then I met with Jessica Milani and Sandra Alvarez to share the document with them, get their feedback. What we thought was going to be a shorter conversation turned into be a much longer conversation to get even more feedback. And again, I think the value was in the asking of important questions so we could talk through why something existed and does it really need to be there. I'm thinking of a few in particular. Does it really need to be there? We did attempt to get students, was not effective. Was not effective. I tried with Schreiber to get students, and the question was, like, not just to get students. We didn't want to stand in the hallway and just corral students. We wanted to get students who have a particular interest in this. And on one level, that timeline collided directly with AP tests. So that became problematic. And then I know Sandra and Jessica made attempts as well, and our timeline just kind of ran out of time. So that's what leads us to today, to the document that we shared with you last week.
But we thought it was important in the timeline to make sure, remember at the beginning of the year, we established a timeline, we're gonna have this back to the committee here in May. So I thank our, and all the different people that gave input in getting a document to this committee on the timeline we expected. Because our goal is to have it in place for the opening of school in September. So if we need to circle back to any of those other constituents along the way, we have time to do that, but we felt it was important to meet the expectations of this committee to bring it to you by May.
That makes sense to me. I think we appreciate seeing it now. And I mean, you started by talking about this being a living document. The Board of Ed is supposed to review it at least annually. And I think that it's good to have a draft out in public, and maybe now we can get more feedback from students and parents, as we move forward. But, if we all treat it like a living document, it also can be evolving.
I should add that the Code of Conduct Committee, where this started, that committee continues. They're part of our 5-year strategic plan with our DEI initiatives. So while the members may change, one of the members on the committee is retiring at the end of the year, the committee still stands, and they have different goals depending on what happens with this particular document, but they can absolutely go back and continue their work on the revisions.
Is there something other than this that they're working on?
Well, they would work on what would be like a year 2 goal, which is really around implementation. And then there's a goal that connects to how do we measure the implementation? How do we go about collecting data? So that committee would end up working with some other committees, kind of like an event diagram because it's only as good as it will be, as it is implemented.
Are they working on the forms that are referenced to?
Not
Not yet, but
Not
that would be the part of their role.
part of the role. We're gonna have to collect those forms, we'll have to update them, we're gonna have to make sure that the forms are uniform. We don't want schools that have different sets of forms.
Can you remind us who the committee members were?
Sure. Eric Mace, Lori Director, Renee McLean, and Wanda Burgess.
Renee McLaren.
Yes.
And who's, I got everybody but the last one.
Wanda Burgess.
Burgess.
I guess, I know I have some comments and questions. Do you want to start? I know you have comments and questions. I'm assuming you have some too.
I'm blocking, I'm going back to work. we're gonna hear for days.
Do you want to start?
And if need be, we can continue this in June. Don't feel like we have to fit it all in today. We know it's a big document. It has a lot of important
Very
points. to it.
dense, oh my goodness. Okay, can I do a general theme, please? There seems to be some, repetitive language, but it's not consistent. So I don't know how, we definitely don't need to go through every single time I see that or feel that, but sometimes pronouns is mentioned in that list and sometimes they're not.
Can I jump in on the pronouns too? I mean, I think that maybe the stuff that's things like that, we could get, like, we could give you markups if you don't mind.
I don't mind
We need
at
to
all.
talk about that.
Yeah.
You know, on a lighter note, one of the things that really shocked me about this document is that you're not an Oxford comma guy, because I really thought you would have been. But, so maybe like, I know what you're talking about, those kind of issues. The pronouns specifically I had a question on, because I was wondering if that's the right terminology. And I don't know, I think like with whatever group, right, as we group people by the similarities that they have. You know, usually there are preferred and non-preferred terminology. Is that what the terminology would be to refer to this? Because if we're trying to be inclusive, we want to make sure we're using the right language, right?
If we were good, so you're saying there's preferred pronouns, so you know, to add preferred pronouns.
Right.
Would that be,
My question was actually broader, and I was genuinely asking because I don't know what, is it preferred pronouns or is it gender identity? Is it something else?
I think the idea is that this is beyond just gender identity,
Okay.
right? That we also want to make sure, like there are people out there whose chosen pronoun is there, and that's not necessarily connected to any sort of gender identity, nor should we assume that it's part of their gender identity. That's just the pronoun that they want to use. So I think we want to disentangle pronouns from strictly gender identity. We also know, you know, some of this gets connected to, I think, what's happening in the world around us. And so we know that there are times where people are misidentified, like, right, mispronouns, like, I don't know a better way to do that. And that is like an act of violence against them, right? It's done with the intention to hurt them. And that's why it's important to add pronouns here. But whether or not the language should say pronouns, preferred pronouns, I'm okay. I like that the question emerged, and I would think that that question would emerge, your question would come out wherever we brought this up.
And like, given the way you explained it, should it be somewhere in the definitions as well?
You know, that's
Because we
brought up
do have other, you know, other groupings in there defined. It may be that, you know, putting something in there will make it clearer what we mean. And also, this would be a great place for student feedback, right?
Yeah.
Because if we want it to be, if we want students to feel they can see themselves in this document and that it really does give them rights and responsibilities and it's something to aspire to rather than a, you know, disciplinary document, which I think is the direction we're trying to go.
Absolutely.
I think having students relate to the way that they are identified with is important.
Just two things. One is I want to make sure I give credit, like Sandy and Jessica were very much a part of the pronoun. That was not in the original round. I just want to make sure I can acknowledge when it's appropriate to acknowledge. The idea of what should go in the definition list, I'm very open-minded about, but I'm also conscious that there's a chance that the definition list becomes pages and pages and pages of just definitions. That being said, I think we could add it, and then if it, you know, doesn't look right or feel right or sound right, we can take it out.
Can we have definitions to the end instead of the beginning, so that it's not a stumbling block, or you think people
No,
should be telling?
Well, I think they have to be defined up front, and I'm certain, although I don't know the process, right? They have been in the beginning of the document forever. I don't know why that was made, other than I just think about when we define terms up front, and then we go and use them repeatedly in the document, and it's just easier to understand.
That makes sense to me.
There's also, in that repetitive listing.
Yeah.
Toward the back, I started to see marital or veteran status, use of a guide dog. That is not used throughout the document. Is there a reason that
What
it's,
page you refer to?
I think the first time I saw it was page 21, maybe? Under discrimination of any kind. And given that it was specifically even under that, felt like, why all of a sudden?
Oh,
I mean, I read every word which was to wonder. It's under discrimination, it's under harassment. So I wasn't sure what the distinction was, if there was one.
I don't know the answer to that. It's interesting as I'm looking at this section, is that it's relatively, other than the title of the section, it's an untouched section.
Right.
So, I'm not entirely sure why, that would be untouched. I don't know if discrimination of any kind appears earlier in the document. But this is a section that starts a few pages earlier that is designed to kind of break out disciplinary actions, right? And it gets increasingly, grows in terms of its intensity. So I think that's the first time, it's the only time in the document that we do that. We provide examples, and so that's my guess as to why that appears, and only appears there. And certainly, we came upon this a number of times, right? There's going to be a lot of times where there's a list, and then there's going to be a phrase like limited, not limited to, or, because I think at times we can be listing things for a long time, and then inevitably we might leave something out, so I think we need a caveat. So that's my guess as to why it's there.
I mean, I think Nan's point is, we have this list elsewhere in the document in a lot of places, and so maybe we just, put a little note here to look at it and figure out if we want those in it throughout, or if we want a not limited to and we leave them out, I think yours is a consistency point.
It's, yeah.
Okay.
Done?
I have a couple of questions, if they're not in the same thing as the next question.
Well, I'll just move one more, because then, like I said, we'll be here for days if we go through mine, but, the other consistent or lack of consistency is, sometimes we see school environment, and sometimes we see school climate. So, I prefer school climate, so I don't know how other people feel about that.
I mean, that gets to my question, which is, similar, related to like, what is the definition of the school walls? You know what I mean? Like, at what point does the school no longer have jurisdiction? At what point does it have jurisdiction? I'm flipping through and I'm seeing it here on page 11, number 6, which it says, confront issues of discrimination, but really the question is like when, or any person who's lawfully on school property. So I think we know that if you're on school property, you're under the school's purview, and that's easy. Or at a school function. I think we know that if the school function is off-site. But then it feels like there are lots of situations, whether they are online or not online, that it is semi-related to school behavior, where the school has purview, but I don't know when that line, I don't know when that line dissipates. For example, is it a bunch of kids that are in summertime, like, or on a school vacation, or on weekend, or like, where do we say when the school has purview and when the school doesn't?
So that, I'm sure Dr. Shields would agree, that line is sometimes hard to find.
Agree.
We need lots of support. This is where we would contact Howard in some cases. By general practice.
Yeah.
A lot of those instances you're talking about, they may happen off campus, online, right?
Yeah.
But they walk into the school later. Whatever happens online, the conflict between kids wanders itself into the school. And once it walks into the school, and this is from my conversation with Howard also, once it wanders into the school, it's in our purview to take action. Two kids, it's hard to think about online, but I was thinking about, two kids agree that they want to fight each other. They're going to do it on a Sunday in August in New Jersey.
Yeah.
They'll have the fight, but the conflict is still going to exist when they become students again back in school, and so the school has to take an action to do something. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to suspend kids, but it does mean that there should be an action. But sometimes when it's online, it's absolutely hard to find.
So I totally agree with everything you said.
It's like the look and feel of how a document is implemented.
I'd love to find a place, because I think that students struggle with this, and I struggle with this with my kids, telling them that you can get in trouble for school, and they're like, why? I was texting my friend. And so I think I would love to see more of a definition of like the scope of when the school can impose disciplinary action. And if it's loosey-goosey, I get that, because, I mean, what I just heard was that it depends on the scenario, and, we're using practice, common practice, and I'm fine with that, but I think that would be helpful to understand here.
Yeah, I think
So,
I think to add to that a little bit, what Howard's always given us advice on is that if it's somehow impacting the school environment, you have an ability to act. Doesn't mean you have to act.
Right.
You have authority to act because it is somehow now impacting the school setting in a negative way.
Right,
So-
I like that, and I think we should find out, like,
So-
a home for it.
So building on Adam's point, I think this idea is in the document. Most specifically, I see it under the definition of harassment and bullying, where we specifically say, as we're defining harassing and bullying, one of the things, there's like an A, B, C, D, and D is, or it occurs off school property and creates or would foreseeably create a risk of substantial disruption within the school environment, where it is foreseeable that the conduct, threats, intimidation, or abuse might reach school property. The idea is there, I see it there in other places, but I think building on what Adam says, it's something that should really be in the introduction. There should be,
Sure.
it shouldn't just be buried in the definitions, maybe we want to add a couple sentences to the introduction too, because there are gonna be people who don't read the definitions and who skim it, and they should understand Adam's right, like, where's the breach?
And there also needs to be a limit to the breach, which is that if siblings get into a wrestling match, that is out of the school's, in my opinion, that is out of the school's jurisdiction, right? Like if two kids are in sleepaway camp in Pennsylvania and they happen to be in the same 5th grade class or whatever, that's the camp's problem, that is not the school's problem. So there needs to be both, a breach that is appropriate, but there needs to be a limit to the breach. And so I'd love to see just a home for it, or what it is. And it sounds like we can make something that is, vague but inclusive.
Yeah, I think it would be impossible, no matter what we wrote, to not be.
Absolutely.
something to interpret.
Yeah. All right.
But I think you raise a good point, from a kid's perspective, they don't really see that as clearly as we do as school leaders.
No.
Or as parents as well.
I have trouble explaining it to my kids when they are, if you do that, you could get suspended. And they're like, well, but I was texting my friend online, and I want to be able to point to something. Okay. Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I kind of think it's in the introduction, it's where that belongs. And I think it could be something as simple as, I guess the wording is all board, but, something about the board, recognizing.
I think it
We
would
can
be
do
that.
wording, but it's something like,
Third paragraph, but the board recognizes, and then maybe there's a sentence that Well, we can draft them, obviously.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
I think we're all on the same page. I don't think it needs to get into all the details, but I think it needs to say that there needs to in some way be recognition that there is conduct outside of school that impacts the educational environment and therefore is subject to this code of conduct. You know, it's something like that. And do you have more?
I'm gonna do the big stuff, and I would rather do like the edits, like just general edits, I don't want to torture people with, if that's okay with everybody.
Okay.
Yeah. So just, I think this is kind of, it's not a big deal, but a big deal at the bottom of the very first page, it's really page number 2. We say vision and portrait of the graduate. Do you want vision and mission?
Yeah, all that.
Okay. So the first issue, we didn't get to, are we changing school environment to school climate? How do we feel about that?
I think maybe, I personally, because it's such a long document, I would say like, let's leave it with the feedback and maybe go through, because I don't wanna give a directive where in certain places it might be more appropriate to use one or the other, right? We
I
don't
read
wanna do it-
every page, it doesn't matter. It's really about the feel of the language, so.
Okay.
But if you want to skip that, that's fine too. So this is a tone thing for me on page 3, under disruptive student. Substantially interferes with the teacher's authority over, I would rather supervision of. Page 3. It's just a
What about teachers' ability to govern the classroom?
that works for you too. Do you have a feeling on that, Adam?
Climate versus environment?
No, page 3, under disruptive student.
I think that's a good recommendation. That's actually consistent with tone. We might have had a conversation about that, I just didn't make the change. That I seem to remember somewhere else it was the same authority or something, and I think.
Am I allowed to chime in?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, we did call out instances of the term, all terms that are punitive in some way, authority, replacing with official. And in this particular case, we also raised the issue of subjective terms, highly subjective terms like disruptive. Insubordinate is another one, and with the recommendation of creating clarity through specificity. Sort of a show, don't tell, what does it actually mean and how, to what extent does it need to interfere with the teacher's ability to manage her classroom? We use words like manage, address. Govern was not one we had suggested, but it works in this instance.
Seems like we're kind of all on the same page on that. We'll tweak that a little bit. While we're on that page, actually, first of all, I really should have started by saying I really appreciate the revision. I think it's something we've been talking about for a long time, and it was necessary, and it's the kind of environment we want. So I appreciate all the effort that went into this. The top of page 3, we have the sentence that says, a disciplinary process that seeks to do with students and not to students will further assist in building character and improve the overall school environment. I love the sentiment. I think the wording is really confusing.
Yeah.
This seeks to do
I circled to
with
do.
students.
Well, this sentence has attracted a lot of attention, a lot of attention, so I'm happy that that's consistent.
That's great. So maybe like if we could reword that in some way. I mean, I think that what we're trying to say is, it's a collaboration with students, and in the same vein as the comment about subjective terms like subordinate and disruptive, I had a question of more disciplinary process and discipline, because it seems like there are many cases where we remove it, and then there are cases where it's left, and I'm just wondering if there was a thought process behind that.
To be perfectly honest, right, so I reviewed a bunch of other codes of conduct that were recommended as exemplars. So some from upstate, Baltimore, Denver, and Ithaca was another. And so I think this sentence, I actually think I pulled it from Ithaca's. So I can.
Stop doing both from Ithaca. Freeze
What's
down
that?
right now. I said, we just stop doing both from Ithaca.
I will use it as an example because I know the guy, no. But disciplinary could come out, we can say, it's, you know, could be a code of conduct. Collaboration, for example, is in the sentence before, which leads me to wonder, well, maybe we don't read the sentence at all.
Uh-huh.
But what I like about the sentence is that it says exactly what we want to do, right? We want to do something more than, being collaborative is nice. If someone pulls a student into an office and says, yeah, you know, this is what you did, this is what's gonna happen, I can call that collaboration. But to say that we want to do something together.
Right.
It
It doesn't have to be collaboration, but I think that, like, I understand what you were going for, is that it's like a coming together to figure out the problem. I should ask, does everybody in the public have a copy of the code of conduct? Yeah.
There's more there on the, they're right
I have an
there.
extra. If you're coming, so you're interested in code of conduct.
I am very interested.
And also I locked you out. All right, I have,
Do we want to go page by page and just pick out the important stuff and not the nonsense edits?
we can. Can I do two also big ones first? I don't know if you have any big ones. So two questions to throw out there. I think, I didn't see any references to recess in here. Did I miss it, Dan?
To what?
Recess.
Oh.
So, thank you. I kind of think it's an opportunity to say something about that, right? We've had, and it's a larger question to me. I think while we're talking about the different disciplinary measures that are available, do we want to talk at all about the ones that should not be available, right? There are a lot of school districts that specifically prohibit taking recess away from children as a punishment. I think there's a lot of science on this issue. I think we have schools that don't do it as a policy, but it is done in some of our schools, maybe not at the building level, maybe at the building level, I don't know. I personally would like to see that in here somewhere, but I don't know where.
Well, so recess is referred to in the document somewhere. I don't remember where recess is, but not not what you're asking for. You know, and having lots of conversations. I don't know how I feel. So I try to imagine what happens on the way to recess. Right? What happens if a student needs to be told, like, on the walk? I don't want to get, I mean, sometimes as I've thought about this for hours and hours and hours and started imagining different scenarios of what could be, right? How do you, and so maybe this is where, and then I don't get too lost in my own weeds.
But I think you're raising an interesting question. Is lunch detention, as it's referred to at the building level, a practice that we want to continue?
Right.
I think that's a question that we should make note of
And
and have conversation around it, because
And for me, I think the answer is strongly no. I think if we're a whole child district, we're at the point where we should have an understanding that the child who's disrupted in class probably needs recess even more. So I've also thought about this a lot over several years. Personally, where I think the line is that a child should not be losing recess as a punishment for anything except dangerous behavior that occurs at recess, right? If a child is dangerous to other students, removing them from the environment makes sense today, right? If they have to be removed in the moment, but otherwise, kid who's misbehaving on the line to recess shouldn't lose recess. A class that's rowdy in the hallway shouldn't lose 3 minutes of recess standing in the hallway showing that they can be quiet. That's a kind of militaristic approach to education that our district has enunciated that we don't want to support, and I don't think we should be allowing it to happen in the ground.
So I did hear that there's some room for it, but it
Like
should be used
removing it?
sparingly.
Yeah, but I mean, the committee can chime in on one person, I'm not even the
I
entire
agree
board.
with the, I agree with the exception, because I agree with the sentiment, and also we have to have the exception there, which is like if the kid is being really bad at recess,
Right.
which is certainly number one option.
Right, if it's a problem at recess and that's the only possible solution for it.
Yeah, but it's not copying out during class.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think we have instances of classes losing a few minutes of recess here and there for various behavior. And by the way, that gets to my other big theme that I would like to see and hear about punishments that we shouldn't have. And that one is communal punishments. An entire class should not be punished for the behavior of a few children. This happens a lot. The Geneva Convention outlaws it, we should outlaw it. It's a way of institutionalizing bullying. We're drafting children to enforce on other children, which, no.
So that one I think is a little bit easier to address, right?
Okay.
The recess one, I also want to, I think some of this, we wander into application. And-
Regulation, right?
Yeah, because I don't think, at some point, we have to give a new document to all the administrators, all the teachers, and highlight the important pieces. And so I think a statement about recess is appropriate. I don't know if you've noted it, but there is a statement about detention. That detention should be, detention, after school detention, I can't,
Look at, I know what you're
but
talking
it
about.
says it should not be, not be assigned to students who have childcare needs or after-school employment. So that's the sort of statement I think we're looking for about recess, right? There's an application piece that the code is not necessarily going to speak to directly, but will happen at the professional development level where we can then highlight some pieces.
Can you tell me what you mean by, like, give me an example of the sentence that you made?
For recess?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm not developed yet. I think something broad that allows the code to say recess should, the loss of recess should not be used as a disciplinary outcome for matters other than poor behavior during recess, or, and then there might be another, I can imagine another piece there, I'm just not sure what it is.
I think what's important here is we've got the sentiment, right? Now we have to go back to the people who are implementing it, right? And to
Absolutely.
say, this is the sentiment that we're getting from the committee that we want to weave into the document. Let's talk about where we do that.
That's what
I'm okay with that.
I don't expect us to have a final draft today at all, so.
No, and really, I appreciate you coming to us with it in draft form because it allows more input into it instead of having it feel finished, which I think also is harder to go back to a committee with, right? It feels bad to a committee. It's better to have it as a collaboration and a back and forth. Yeah.
I've got two. I've got one that's easier and one that's harder. You want to do the easier one first?
Which are?
So page 23 talks about cheating, and there's a new way to cheat that I think we need to address in some way, which is, generative AI. And I think we just need to have something speaking directly to, it doesn't have to say AI, but it has to basically say that the student in some way has to generate the, the writing or the information themselves rather than relying on, a system that will answer the questions for them. I don't know what the right wording is, but I think we have to address it.
It's,
And it can be very broad.
it's interesting that you raised that, because I was looking at the cheating list, I was thinking, we need something. I was thinking about whether or not, like, presenting work that's not your own as your own is encompassed by plagiarism, and I think to Adam's point, it isn't, right? So maybe it's adding something to the list, like,
As long as we call it out so it's very clear that, like, if you ask the computer to write a one-page response on something or other, like, then that response is not your homework.
So in plagiarism, we could add parenthetically, or, AI.
well,
It does
it's,
say,
except that it's not plagiarism.
well, it says, well, I understand,
Oh, I see what you're
it
saying. You're
says
saying
or
you
an entire
want
paper or
plagiarism.
project obtained from another individual, downloaded from the internet. So I would think
I
that
think
would
we
cover
need
it.
something, it's,
You can certainly add, including
that's
the
fine.
use of, artificial intelligence
Yeah.
like ChatGPT.
Yeah, because for me, like, something that is like, that's, first, downloading something from the internet wasn't possible in the 80s, right? And then all of a sudden in 2000 was. Now we have a whole new technology that is going to basically allow you to, you don't even have to go find the paper. It's not written by another human, it's written by, this generative AI. But it is you not writing your 3-page paper just the same, so I just want to be,
Yeah, I think there's a way for us to add it and make sure the language lives.
all right, excellent, thank you.
I think that that's a good idea, but I think we should also kind of put a pin in this conversation, and I'm sure this is something that administrators are talking about a lot,
I mean,
about how to handle this,
it's
because it's
everywhere,
new
right? The
work.
conversation is being had everywhere, and I think in terms of educational value, educational use, I think that's the part that we need to figure out, that conversation. But in terms of cheating, yeah, we don't want kids using that and claiming it's their own work.
Well said.
I have a question on that paragraph while we're here, 2 questions actually. Do you think there's a difference, and do we need to distinguish between intentional or unintentional plagiarism? Or is it not necessary and something that's taken into account? And question 2 is the last sentence says this includes the recycling of one's own work and submitting for a different assignment. I don't know that that's
Just tell me
plagiarism.
exactly where you are.
The
Plagiarism.
last
Yeah, I
sentence
see
is
it.
no plagiarism.
Oh, I see.
The last sentence, I just don't know that that's plagiarism. It might be cheating, but can you plagiarize yourself?
I don't think it's cheating.
I don't think it's cheating or plagiarism.
Yeah,
So maybe
it's
it's,
getting lucky.
Yeah.
If you receive feedback from a teacher on the first assignment and then submitted that, again, with, incorporating any feedback you might get from a teacher, may give you a leg up. But I can ask for clarity as to why that's there.
Okay.
I'm guessing that is based on someone's personal experience, as I read it.
Oh, I totally do.
I'm sure, and I don't think I necessarily have a problem with that, right? Like, if we want students to get value out of class, they can't simply submit the same essay over and over and over again, right? But I don't know that it actually fits under plagiarism or cheating, but I guess maybe so. You'll talk about that further.
Yeah,
I think we can leave that.
and your other question was,
Does it matter intent on plagiarism? Does it matter to us?
So I will tell you, I had an experience where I was teaching, so this was I was a TA in grad school, but I had a student that basically just did not cite enough. In other words, they talked about their ideas, and in reality, I found those ideas in the book. And if they had put in 10 more citations, it wouldn't have felt like it was plagiarism, and it didn't. To me, it felt like a borderline case, and it didn't feel like it was very different than them copying a paper from somebody else and handing it. So I think intent is there. I think there is a different, there's value to differentiating intent and non-intent.
So would it be something where we want to say that intent would be taken into account?
I think
Or
that's a
something
nice
like
way to
that?
get discretion on something like that.
we can, just imagining it from a teacher perspective, right? There are people out there who believe, intent doesn't matter. Plagiarism is plagiarism, hard and fast. I would say that in practice, lots of things get taken into account. But very rarely is it you get a 0, no conversation, no nothing. I think some of it is practice, look and feel, and then, yeah, of course it gets taken into account. But we can add a sentence in there.
And you had another one, I think.
Dress code.
Yeah,
So I'm not that familiar with any of the, I've heard that many dress code battles, but I'm not actually familiar with them.
Remind me, page, please.
Oh, it's page 16 and 17. I'm looking at the old one, I'm looking at the new one. And everything I'm seeing in the new, I'm not seeing anything specific in here. I'm seeing intent, and then I'm seeing school officials shall help students develop an understanding for appropriate appearance in school setting. Like, none of this tells me in general, like, what my kid can and can't wear. And so the question is, for the code of conduct, like, does that vary by school? Is this a building level decision where, like, it's something that might be appropriate for a 17-year-old is not appropriate for a 6-year-old, or is it universal?
that attracted a lot of attention also. I think it's, not only do I think it's difficult to have like hard, fast, specific terminology, because there's always going to be subjective application, right, depending on what happens. I think, of course, there's a difference between what a 6-year-old and what a 17-year-old. It's true in our houses also, right? So we're going to apply it there first, which is, I think, what the code really speaks to also, right? This is a parental responsibility first. I think the second part of that is I don't think it's common practice now in 2023 to make a list of approved and unapproved items for dress. I think the list that you see, which is in paragraph 3 on page 17, I think that is what we see more of, right? This is what you can't support, advocate for, advertise. I think those are the things, as opposed to nothing off the shoulder, as opposed to baseball caps, as opposed to the length of a skirt. Those are the things that used to exist in dress codes that don't exist.
So then how do we monitor them so that our kids grow up and they know what is appropriate to wear in a professional setting and what is not appropriate?
Well, I think what's appropriate, this is one of those areas where I think this ends up being a bit coded language, right? So what is appropriate in sort of white normative culture is one thing, and then what's appropriate in other cultures, many of which are live and breathe in our district, is very different. A language, right? We don't necessarily need to impose what we believe is appropriate. We do that by the way we send our kids out of our homes. But we shouldn't necessarily apply that in our schools in one particular way. So how do we do it for a multitude? It's really hard. There is a piece in the code at the bottom that puts the onus on schools to make sure the school leaders are well educated about what appropriate attire is for other cultures. And that doesn't mean that you wear anything, anywhere, any way you want, but it should be an understanding that different cultures have a different set of what is appropriate. And so that word is challenging all by itself.
I will share with you that when I first came to the district many years ago, there were dress codes that had very specific language in it. And over time, as we examined those dress codes, we realized that they were like targeting certain audiences that it was inappropriate. And we needed to move away from that. Because what's appropriate in your home may be different than what's appropriate in someone else's home. And we have to work with families to find that balance of comfort in a school setting. And I remember when I was hired as the middle school principal, that was something the board looked at me and said, we want you to address the strictness of the dress code in the middle school because we feel it's a little too strong. So I went in and helped change that environment and that tone around that conversation. So I helped rewrite the middle school dress code in the last couple of years because it was a little bit more strict and stringent than we felt as a district we wanted to be. And it's more about collaborating with the families to make sure everyone's comfortable in the educational setting. So that's why this code, other than that paragraph 3, has moved away from things like baseball caps and, types of shirts and things like that.
I like the change in tone.
I see the point you're raising,
Yeah.
right? Because this sentence, the school officials will help understand, develop an understanding of appropriate. It does make you say, okay, but like, what is appropriate? There's a lot what will the details look like this? I see what you're saying, but the problem is that dress codes are a sticky wicket everywhere. And there has been this evolution, I think, in the country, but here too. I mean, the dress code in place today is very different than even 2 years ago, which was really a leftover, right? And I think that's the evolution in the country, but like if you start to think about, or we could be open to hearing like what specifics you would want in a dress code, a lot of them start to be either very culturally specific or very gendered,
Well, that's
right?
also.
And
a huge
discriminatory
concern.
against girls.
Huge concern, right? Most of our, just to give you an example from, in practice, from my experience at Schreiber, a bunch of us would greet students every morning and in the lobby, and there would be conversations, right? Depending on who I'm with, what teachers, what assistant principals, different kids would walk in and we'd say, hey, what's that? Do you think that's inappropriate? There'll be a bit of a discussion. We want that in practice. We want administrators, people who are applying this, we want them to talk to each other so that there can be discussion and arrival at some point. But it frequently ends up being a discussion about what girls wear and not what boys wear. And that is real, we have to move, not just us, everybody has to move away from that. So that's one part. It's really complicated.
So this still contemplates though, each school then having its own dress code, right? And if we're assuming that, or even if we're not assuming that, I think my question is, what practice on the ground looks like when we don't have more specificity. I'm gonna, generalize, but in general, I hear like our high school, anything goes, you wear whatever you want.
That's paragraph 3.
Right?
It doesn't.
And I hear people the students call it dress coded. At Weber, it's not consistent. It's certain teachers have certain views, other teachers have other views. It's whatever the specific teacher does. I think we want to deal with that inconsistency as well.
Yes.
Right? I hear among students, oh, well, you're wearing a tank top today, but put your sweatshirt on for that one's class, right? I don't think we want that. How do you deal with that in practice when the language is loosey-goosey?
I think what's important is that
Yeah.
the building tone and codes cannot be in violation of board policy.
Right.
That's the very important message that we need to make sure all our teachers and administrators are aware of.
So are there rules?
Nor can there be, and at the elementary level, we also need to move to a place where we need to a place where they're unified. 1, right, not 5. That's important also.
Will that be found in regulation? How will that manifest itself?
I think what happens now is that the schools generate a list of rules that are built off of the code of conduct, and they circulate that list of rules to the school. Just to give you a Schreiber example, that nowhere in the code of conduct does it say that 9th graders and 10th graders can't go off campus. That is a rule that is unique to Schreiber, and that gets built into what gets distributed to students. And so it will be found in there, but it can't be in violation of this. So we have to work towards some of this also to get everybody on board. But I think, Rachel, your question is, this is about a real big issue for us. And that is, how do we go about collecting data? And how do we go about collecting data that we can then analyze, right? So frequently, instances that would involve dress code violations are not previously would not have wound up entered into a computer system that we can then, look at and say who is part of this violation. Because one of the things we want to look at is what happens post-violation, meaning if a child doesn't have something to change into, if a parent cannot come to the school immediately, does that child miss instructional time for this? It says like they shouldn't, but does that happen? More than that, there's a pipeline that exists here, right? It's an easy place to wander into being insubordinate if you are in violation of something. So what we need to do a better job of data collection at every level. And I believe that Synergy, you can see how all of this wanders into every other area. That Synergy will make it easier for us to collect data so that we can then answer those questions.
That makes sense to me, and you strayed into data, which was gonna be, my next question is, how do we even know, like, what's happening? So that's great.
Right.
Less, a lower school question for me about dress code though is, what about, sometimes we hear about students not going out for recess because they're wearing shorts, right? It's too cold. Where does that fall in this, right?
Right.
Like, does the school make that decision, or did the parents make the decision when they sent them to school that way that they can just?
Or they're required to
freeze
wear
for
their
30
jackets
minutes?
during recess even though they're melting because they weren't around for 20 minutes. So
Right,
it's
does
like
that fall
goofy
under dress code?
stuff. Yeah, I don't know.
I think that's the sort of thing that we would have conversations with the principals and talk about, actual application. Right? I mean, you and I agree on this, but.
We don't want to get into the policy about, winter coats are required during the winter months. Because the reality is that some kids, don't wear winter coats, and some kids wear shorts 12 months a year. And I don't think that's a place we want to spend our energy.
Oh, I think that Nan and I are both on not requiring it, right? And whether we needed to specifically say we're not requiring it.
Yeah. If a kid chooses to wear shorts when it's 30 degrees outside and they want to go to recess, I think they should go.
To the extent that this sets the tone and everybody has to comply with it, I kind of think that, in addition to this, noting that it's a diverse community, I think that we should add something about dress codes not being discriminatory, right? Like any dress code at the building level should not discriminate. Maybe it's after the building principal shall be responsible for informing of the dress code, that sentence at the end. Maybe there should be a line there that says, no dress code should be discriminatory against.
Nobody ever thinks they are, but thank you.
No,
It's
well,
true, but
at the top, it says, therefore, the district policies respect the students' right to express themselves, gender, cultural identity, religious expression, and or beliefs.
I mean, I think that one, by the way, you raised one of my other points, that should be an including but not limited to, not an EG. To my mind, right? But, I don't know, I mean, maybe you can think about whether or not there should be an actual, you're right, nobody thinks they're discriminatory. We've had a dress code in this district that said no do-rags. The person who wrote that probably was not thinking, I'm gonna discriminate,
That
right?
was probably a very long time ago.
Right, like,
And how not?
it's
Just
a
how not?
it's a different cultural time, and then it stays, right? But it's still, noting that we don't intend to discriminate
fair.
is maybe worth doing, because it still gives us something to point to and say, hey, by the way, right?
It's important.
When you say no tank tops, this is not, equally gender, equally enforced against all genders, Did you have something else, Al?
Yeah, I want rules. I want something in here that says my kids have to wear shoes to school.
It does say that.
It does say that.
Does it? Where do I have shoes?
It says
It's
appropriate
appropriate.
and safe footwear should be worn at all times.
Paragraph 2, page 7.
Okay, but, along that vein, that they should not be dressed for the beach. I don't believe, and if it's done at the building level, I'd love to see what the building level says. But I think when we don't articulate things, we leave it up to interpretation, and that creates the inconsistency that we are all complaining about. So you can't have it both ways. You either get a broad brush thing where you get inconsistency across teachers, or you have to make clear rules. I'm of the, camp that like we should try to do our best to make clear rules and reduce the inconsistency, but you can't have it both ways. Like, if you have the inconsistency, you just say appropriate, well, appropriate is different for everybody.
So what rules would you put in this?
No swimwear.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, but that's, quite honestly, that's not my role. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of places where it says professional attire is required. Professional's not quite the right word, but like, there should be a level, and, and I think there's a fixation on not being, not being gendered in this, but at the end of the day, it is not professional for, like, you can walk around the city with men without a shirt, and women cannot do that, right? So there is some genderization that we have to deal with.
Could it, so I'm assuming behind the scenes already, there is or should be communication between our secondary schools about what we want to communicate to students, because we want to have consistency there between Weber and Trevor. And you already mentioned having the elementary schools have one dress code. Does this get addressed for you by having language about there being consistency among the schools when they put these dress codes together? Or that doesn't solve it?
Yeah, but I want to maybe next time what we do is we bring out, because this is a big issue, I hear about it all the time, and I want to see maybe what the regulations are at the middle school and high school and elementary school levels, so that we can see if there's actual like substance to it that will prevent the inconsistency that we're talking about. That's what I'm looking for.
It might help our administrators if you gave some more examples. So I heard no beachwear shoes, what?
I actually have something to say that has in line with what he's saying. I don't know what point you want to ask other board members, because I think can I say something?
Chime in now, go for it.
Because I think what Adam brings up is a bigger question, and I think the word that he said is, I want rules. And the code of conduct was meant to be about rules, right? What you can and cannot do. The revisions that we have put into place have made it less rules of what you can and cannot do, and more in line with the work that we've done as a school district in our diversity, equity, and inclusion committees, the work that we've discussed as a school district about punishment and whether we're moving away from actual punishment versus restorative practices. And so I feel that there's a bigger discussion on, and I think we kind of started it at one point last year, year before, I don't remember, about how do we feel as a Board of Education about restorative practices versus rules. Because when you put in rules, if you do this, that's the rule, then you will do this. And we've taken out my interpretation of reading this very broadly and just reading it now. I didn't spend as much time as Annette did, but reading it very broadly, it seems like we've left it very open-ended, and so they're open-ended about what the punishment is, and there really isn't. And so that's my general kind of putting it out there, and I don't know if the Board of Education should be having a discussion on, are we all on board with moving towards restorative practices? I appreciate all the work that the committee has done, but I don't want us to undo something that they've done or give them more work to do if we're not all on the same page. I will now add a little caveat. Having been sitting on the Board of Education and on the Diversity Committee of the Lead Learners, I am a little concerned now, as of last night. I'd like to see there, so now I'm not gonna sound like I'm blocked, some more rules type of thing, because we were told last night at the Board of Education meeting that there is some really bad bullying at the middle school that could potentially cause suicide. And I don't see in this code of conduct anything that says you cannot do these things. And if you do these things, you will be suspended. You will be, like, I want it to be a little bit more strict because I don't wanna have anything left to interpretation on that end. So I'm putting it out there as really more confusing, but we cannot have a conversation, as Adam said, having it both ways. So we either are all in agreement that we're, going more restorative or we're not. And if we're not, then we need to have rules. But then I do think in some situations, there need to be very strict rules. Also, just because I'm speaking and I have nothing to say, in the code of conduct, we referenced the academic integrity policy that the Board of Education has, and I know you guys as a committee just spent some time talking about some of the things. I think maybe the policy committee should then look at that policy again to just make sure whatever you said today is in the policy. Same thing with the transportation policy. We have a bus transportation policy that I already had that. See, in my brief thing, you did it detailed. There's a bus transportation policy that we should probably make sure A, it's referenced in here, and B, make sure that it's in line with whatever the code of conduct. I'm not saying anything else. I do think, Rachel, as the policy committee chair, you should have a conversation with the Board of Education in general about how do we all feel.
I mean, I think that definitely this is not something that should just go on for first read with no conversation. We should have a board level conversation about it, also for the benefit of the public too, and an opportunity for the public to come and comment on it. I see what you're saying, because there are things that in a friendly, warm, whole child school, we simply don't want to tolerate, I think is what we're getting at. But to me, and I think this is the intent too, like saying that we believe in restorative justice is not mutually exclusive with having it be that there are things that require a disciplinary action of some kind
Agreed.
for the protection
So it
of
should
the
be
community.
stated, and I don't, when reading this, I don't see that stated that way. So I think, I agree 100%, and I think it should be stated that we believe and our goal is to always look for the appropriate, age-appropriate discussion, the understanding the diversity of the family. However, there are certain infractions that will not be tolerated under any circumstances, and those should be listed.
I think a restorative.
That's what I'm saying. I just think we need to have something
I was
really in
wanting
there.
to put that in the introduction, somewhere where we're talking about our general philosophy of how we approach quote unquote discipline. And our belief in restorative practice with, its nuance or how there's language that we
I
can.
know this is a hard balance to strike, and I'm
It is.
sure that Dr. Schultz and Dr. Pernick, like, you're already having many, many thoughts in your head, because it is, you can want to create and foster a community where students are on board with this code of conduct. It doesn't mean that we're having a drum circle all day long and we're in a state of nature and people get to treat each other however they want, because we're gonna do restorative practice instead of addressing what's going on. So maybe,
I
I
think
mean,
we're
maybe it's
making too many
another-
assumptions that restorative practice implies, zero
consequence.
ramifications for poor behavior, so.
No, it's a
I
way
think
of,
it needs to be part of the definitions or something.
I will say, so I shied away from those terms because you can't, schools and districts don't just implement restorative practice. Right? They get implemented after a lot of professional development, after investment in learning about, and these are not lowercase letters, these are capital letters.
yeah,
So they mean something when you write them in a document, and it usually means that the people who are going to be implementing this have been appropriately trained, and we have some way to then go and have efficacy of how we're going to implement that. So that hasn't happened yet. And so maybe that's a larger conversation around if we want to move our disciplinary practices in that way. There is a specific way of implementing restorative practices into a school district. I would say, though, that the message we want to send is that we want to take into account as many different factors about children before we embark on a disciplinary outcome. And that we want to do it in as deliberate a fashion, right? One of our goals is to reduce disproportionality. And so we try to create a document that will speak to practices that will lead us in that direction. Again, implementation is going to be everything. I've seen lots of codes of conduct that do a little bit more of what you're talking about, Emily, right? They create, right, this infraction equals this. And every single one of them, it is a range of outcomes. It is not a defined outcome, because we don't ever want to put ourselves in a position where we no longer can take into account all the things that we want to take into account. So it's a fine line to walk. And I think Weber internally has some sort of document that they use to try
We
to
do.
help them.
Yeah.
And so perhaps you can.
Does Driver too have a
Yeah.
student? Because I've seen a list somewhere, is that only at Weber?
Weber.
I don't, and so this is long, so I don't know if this is in here, but I think it's applicable to this conversation. One of the things that I have seen on the ground in our district, in many of our schools, is that when a child, student does something that is inappropriate or hurtful, in many of our buildings, many of our administrators already have a practice where they're really dealing with both the victim and the aggressor in a way that is compassionate and warm and healing, and trying to address the roots of what's going on with the child who's acting out, as well as the other child, which I think is progressive and the way that we see from social science actually works. I don't know that that feeling is encapsulated here anywhere. But I think it is actually the practice in many, if not all of our buildings. So I don't know if that tone helps, because I think we have two issues, right? We have the tone and then we have setting clear expectations, which I think is what the comments about having rules are. And that's it's a hard message to get across, both in a paper document and to students. To say, we care about you, we're gonna work with you, we wanna make sure everybody's okay, we wanna make sure everybody feels treated sensitively based on their various identities. But also, your rights stop where the other student's nose begins, right? Like, it really comes down to basic philosophy here, like, you cannot hurt the people around you, and if you do that, there are consequences. I think it's what we're getting at, right? So that's a pretty global comment. Adam, do you have another one?
No, and I know I'm one person, but that was my comment on the dress code, is that I would like more specificity.
Since this is such a big document, I'd like to open it up to the people who are sitting here to comment on either the dress code or this rules and specificity versus less specificity issue. If anybody has anything you want to add to the conversation?
I'll give, I guess, so just basing on, first of all, thank you for this work, it's great, I know this is a living document and it has much more to go ahead. I just want to say, from an end user standpoint, I still find this document difficult to read. If I really had a code of conduct problem, I don't know there's too many paragraphs. Adam Block didn't even see the shoes, because they're in the last sentence of the fourth paragraph under the thing and it all has to say was wear appropriate shoes, bullet point, right? So to that point, that's just an overall comment on it. I still find it a little clunky, but I think that this is still a document in process, but I'm adding that. So the point that Rachel just made, and also tying into the discussion about climate and culture, and even Adam Black's comment about where does this document apply. I think one of the things, even though we have this introduction here and it's written out lovely, I think this is the opportunity to talk about climate and culture. And this is where you start out and you say, our goal and objective is to build and foster a positive environment where everyone is respectful and we feel safe and, based on, and everyone can come to school and we want you to be engaged and we are not hierarchical anymore, but rather we are reciprocal, right? Or whatever the words that you want to do. And outline kind of that, set that tone of the school culture and climate from the start. Then move into your discussion in bullet points only of where does this apply? It applies into school grounds, off school grounds, utilize that language that's been given to us, that even if it happens off school grounds, but it's brought from the outside in and is causing a disruption within the schools, that's how we know this is when this applies. If you're on a school bus, right, there's 4 bulleted enumerated points that, again, create like a semblance of here's what we're doing and here's where this is going to apply, to then kind of go in an entry point into, what's going to happen and lead you down that road. In regards to this whole discussion that Emily brought up and even the idea of what we should be doing in that regard, I understand the struggle. I do think that there is a way to craft a matrix. I mean, we already outlined specific items in here, use of your electronic devices. There's going to be different levels of there'll be different levels of consequence, right? Based on what it is. If I took a laser pointer at class and I just was disruptive, right? I had disruptive behavior. I'm not getting a suspension for that. So you could say use of your portable things, that's a level 1 versus a level 2 versus a level 3 and level 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all defined and it then leads you to suspension. And just clearly kind of giving everyone that matrix or roadmap to understand, like, I get a written warning here, I get spoken to there, whatever the circumstances may be. Am I making sense? Like you're outlining for everyone. There's disruptive behavior and then there's like not bad, I don't want to say bad, I'm sorry, that's the wrong word. There's disruptive behavior, and then there's behavior that does warrant a greater level of seriousness. If you bring a weapon to school, that is very different than disruptive behavior, and that consequence is going to be very different. I don't think that I think we should make it abundantly clear in that regard, and I still think in that regard, you're not saying that this is a stern consequence for your behavior, you're just giving them that roadmap and that matrix about basically where they will fall on the scale, and also guidance for the administration on how they should be operating, right? Define your different levels, because then it's going to go to the next part of my comment, which is one of the aspects that we should do under dissemination and review that I felt was not adequately covered is that the Board of Education, the district, and the community should be receiving either twice a year or once a year some sort of report on where do we stand on all of this. How many dress code violations resulted in suspension? How many of these infractions resulted in a level 1 or level 2 versus a suspension? And I'm using these level 1s, level 2s just because I have no better terminology. But that information should be included in a report, and it should be enumerated so that, again, for future viewing, the administration and the Board of Education knows. On January 1st, you don't even have to say January 1st, you can say twice a year, but we're going to get a report and it's going to be made known, these types of things, and we're going to tell you what's happening in each subgroup and where it's happening and where it's not happening at each level within our pre-K through 12 district. And then that way, we'll have actual tangible data with which we can then edit our code of conduct, our living document, as you said in the very beginning, and go back and make, and what's going to be clearer for us, as opposed to speaking in this, I heard at this school, this is what they do, and I heard at that school, this is what they do. We're going to, and we'll have a system and a process written down for future administrators and Board of Education to kind of outline. So that's my long and short one piece. I don't know if I think I went overstepping my bounds, but.
It's a free for all here. We have no matrix, so. You can
Well,
talk
beyond
for as
your
long as
question,
you
how about that,
want.
what's beyond your question?
It's fine. So a couple of things on what you said. I agree with you about the intro being the place for climate and culture to be talked about. I think that's what you're aiming for in this intro. And I think a lot of that is here, so maybe we're all on the same page, but maybe we're hearing we want even a little bit more in certain areas.
But I would even say this is our school climate and culture, like really just clearly say it, don't call it an introduction, school climate and culture.
I see what
Right?
you're saying. Yeah,
Be
yeah,
clear, like, don't use, these are vague terms.
Like, it's not an introduction.
It's not, it's, this is our philosophy now, this is not just a this is a philosophy of how we're guiding ourselves, right? And so set it that way, and set that tone right
Right,
before
or
we
it's
begin.
overarching principles or something like that, I see what you're saying. Then on the matrix, I actually would love to hear from the two of you, because I know the problem with matrices, even in the criminal world, right? And I think in codes of conduct, is that often, even when you have a range, they end up being enforced disproportionately, and it hits Black and brown children harder. Even with everybody's best intentions, and I'm not saying anything like that is happening intentionally here. So I'm assuming in the year-long odyssey, the committee and you and central office had conversations about making something like a matrix versus not making something like a matrix. Can you talk about that for a little bit? And give us a little of your thinking? I mean, maybe you're wrong, maybe you didn't.
No, so we don't have one, so there really wasn't a discussion about should we have one.
Okay.
I can just say that this is a huge issue just for me personally, as I think this through. There are lots of research on implicit bias that encourages the use of a matrix, right? If you take away ambiguity, then there's less of a likelihood that implicit bias plays a role in determining outcomes for kids. That makes sense to me. At the same time, I think that is, first, I've seen them used, like they're so broad, right? There is no matrix that says, and the easiest one I lived with was like, you punch another student, you're getting suspended.
Right.
No, I don't care what the circumstance is, or you cannot lift a hand and punch another child. End of story. But you use an example of like a laser pointer. I can tell you from experience, right? The use of a laser pointer, they're not all the same. So the matrix for that, if we ever created something that had, that level of specificity, the number of outcomes that are potential from that is going to be 6, 7, 8 pieces long. So I'm not sure it gets where we want to go. I just think it's complicated. I often think about it in terms of right now, like 1.0, we want to revise the document so that it is an inclusive document, that it recognizes our community members that don't speak English as a native language. It acknowledges that we are going to, by rule, we are going to make sure that we communicate with parents in their preferred language. We're going to make sure that parents get communicated with before their children receive a disciplinary outcome by rule. And we are going to acknowledge. Right, so I'm saying like that to me is 1.0. I think the matrix, I think that's, that's not the issue. I would think it's 2.0. Because the users have to be around this table for that.
How does a building principal
Yeah.
currently decide what punishments are available for certain infractions? I'm assuming each building principal.
So our current conduct speaks very clearly to the list of possible consequences. It's very clear. The low level to the out-of-school suspension for a long period of time is the high level, right? And it's the building administrator's discretion to what is appropriate for the circumstances that are now before us. What's good about our code of conduct is it gives us latitude to take into account Was the laser pointer used just to put a spot on the wall, or was it used to shine in the eyes of the teacher? It's different.
Right,
But they still use the laser pointer in class.
right.
But it's very, very different what the intent was and the action. So the code needs to have the flexibility like it does now.
Mhm.
But we do acknowledge that there are certain behaviors that lead to X consequence, no
That's in
matter
the code
what.
right now? That's what you just said,
Yeah.
that's in
Laser
the code?
pointers, laser
For-
pointers.
No, not laser.
The laser pointers, and there are certain
Violence,
Yes.
weapons,
Yes, yes.
they're
Well,
very specific.
What,
Now.
where is that?
Uh,
I'm sorry.
It
It
was
There's
was
certain
in the
things
environment
like-
acts, yes.
Like bringing a knife to school,
But
bring,
it's still.
It's in here.
I understand that I did read parts that said if you do that, you know, like you, but it's still, in my opinion, not direct consequence. It still says may result. May, and the word, and I understand, I really understand that there could be different, like, you know, having that word in there, but there, again, certain behaviors, there should be no may, in my opinion. And those are the certain behaviors that cause a danger to another child or administrator or person in the building.
I don't think you're ever gonna get to a place where the word may doesn't exist, right? We would say a
You
student
can't
brings,
bring a gun,
right, so you may be suspended for up to
no,
a
you
year.
will be suspended.
I understand, but I think,
I mean, you will be suspended, your suspension may be, you will,
I'm
so
just
here's
saying,
the
we're not gonna get
terminology.
rid of it.
You cannot bring your gun to school, you will be
I
suspended.
thought that
Your suspension may be up to a year.
Right,
See where may comes
that's,
in?
that's the whole
That's
discussion.
okay, but we agree, may is gonna live.
So where, but it's where will may be.
So, hold on, can I jump in here? I thought the language, I mean, a weapon in school is the most extreme. I thought that that was not permissive language, actually. Do you know where it was on here?
I can find it.
I'm trying to remember where it was, because I also read it.
Can I also just add one little asterisk to my matrix comment, because again, I'm just spitballing based on things. The matrix also helps us collect the data, so I just think what we're missing here is something that helps us collect data to build those reports to then analyze, which is something we haven't looked at, so that we can then be informed when we're looking back and forth. So whatever the tool is, or ease and simplicity, if it's a form that every school is filling out for disciplinary actions and and interventions and whatever, that's fine. And just, that really was my point also, is that in order to collect data, you have to have one system that's the same, that you're comparing against other things. So I wanted to put that little asterisk there on that.
thank
So,
you, that's helpful. In the
yeah.
context of data collection, I
Yes.
very much understand.
So I'm glad you said that, because I had a data collection point I'm gonna come back to. First, look at page, and thank you, Dr. Fernick, for finding it. Page 32 and 33, very clear, the language is not permissive, right? It says, any student other than a student with a disability found guilty of bringing a weapon onto school property will be subject to suspension from school for at least 1 calendar year. It also says students who commit violent acts other than bringing a weapon to school, any student other than a student with a disability who's found to have committed a violent act other than bringing a weapon onto school property shall be subject to suspension from school for at least 5 days. So I agree with you at this extreme, but it is in here.
Right.
On the data collection point, last year, maybe the end of the previous year, when we met with NYU and they presented it to the board and a lot of our administrators, one of the discussion topics was data collection on disciplinary issues at the elementary level. And I know that some of our principals and administrators raised what I thought was a very interesting and valid point, which is the flip side of collecting this data so thoroughly is that you're creating a permanent record for a child who's very young, and that they didn't want to create like a reputation and a persona that then follows the child over the kind of things that really don't rise to the level of needing to be documented. So I I mean, maybe we have a board level conversation, I think the administrators have a conversation, but I just wanted to put out there that there is a tension here,
Oh,
Yes.
right?
Oh, yes.
You definitely don't want to be documenting every little thing that a child does and creating a record that looks like this is like a bad child. That's counter to,
Right.
what we're trying to go for here.
Yeah, it's another part of the balancing act.
Right.
We want meaningful data to know how our code of conduct is working or not working. But yet we don't want to be creating something for kids when they're age 5. They
Right.
made a misstep, doesn't mean when they're now age 17, that's still a
Right,
consequence that haunts them.
right. And then we
It
have
is
a
that
record
balancing
that
act.
says, oh, look what you did in first grade.
But I think then, from the board's perspective, there should be, I'm sure there already is, right? What do we do with school records? If there's something, there is a board policy about school records. I also think that those reputations that you speak of, they exist. Whether they're codified or not, they exist, they're whispers. And that is more poisonous, I think, than anything. That's one part. The second is, we need to come up with a way to identify and reduce disproportionality. We can only do that. Like, we know at the suspension level that disproportionality exists. It is logical, I think, to think that it would exist at every level of discipline, and that it's possible that at the elementary level especially, kids who are maybe disproportionately disciplined, and we don't collect their data, that it's possible that those kids become the kids who get suspended when they reach middle school and high school. For whatever, it's all possible. And we need to continue to do training on other things, so we can get to a proper implementation.
So, I mean, there's a core question, right? We need to, it's a directive, we need to produce disproportionality. It's part of equity, it's part of fairness, part of justice, part of teaching ethics to kids, right? Is for them to see a fair environment. How do you do it? Like, really on the ground, how do you do it? Because it's not just the building level, it's each classroom, right? I'm sure everybody's heard an anecdote about, the one kid that this teacher hates, right? Like, that's the level. We're down into every classroom, but also into building level. And I'm going to give our district the benefit of the doubt. Hopefully we have less overt bias and racism than other places geographically. Hopefully, I'm not going to say we have none, but hopefully. But there's still a lot of implicit bias. Is it professional development? Is that the answer, or is there more to it? How do we actually get to it?
Well, I think it starts by doing what we're doing right now, creating a document that the Board of Education and the district puts out that speaks directly to wanting to be inclusive to all of our families. If we can create a document that has meaning, that we can say this is a shift, and we are stating this is a shift, that recognizes parts of our community that had previously been unrecognized in our code of conduct. That gives us, I think, an immediate line to professional development on how to utilize the code of conduct. I think it also becomes something that we can distribute, maybe not in this form, maybe we come up with a bullet point form that we can distribute in all languages to say, hey, this is what we are doing because we believe that this is a problem. And then there is professional development, right? We need to do professional development on implicit bias. We need to do professional development on what to do if you're walking in the hallway and there's a racial slur uttered at no one in particular, but what to do. Just walking by it helps to create a school climate that is not safe for everybody who's there. And that's in this document, which didn't previously exist.
I know we're a little
Rachel, can I
over.
just add one more second?
Do you guys mind if we go a few minutes longer and then we let you go? Because I think we're clearly, and we clearly, is that okay if we go to 11:15?
Is 11:15 reasonable?
Yeah, is that okay? Because it's also reasonable for you to say, no, we gotta cut it off now, because we're clearly not done with this conversation. I think we all have other stuff, and it's an ongoing
I'm loving this
conversation.
conversation.
I know you like the intellectual stuff.
I like it.
Good.
Um, 5 minutes longer.
We didn't get to
Deb
that,
did.
and then Sandra.
Emily, can we wait 1 second and we just let Sandra add anything or Deborah add something and then we'll come back to you since we only have.
I'm happy to wait for community comments, just making sure that there's an opportunity.
Okay, so in the third paragraph on page 2, where it says the first goal in teaching ethics is to give students a sense of how important these values are. I don't understand what that sentence is supposed to say. We don't talk about ethics anywhere else, we don't have an introduction, and then we start out with this grand, broad statement, first goal in teaching ethics. So somewhere in maybe the introductory paragraph, we should say that we're trying to teach ethics as well, otherwise to me the sentence is misplaced. And also how important these issues, what issues are we talking about? I'm trying to go very quickly so that Sandra can have time. Like, what are these issues? What are we talking about?
I think I circled that as well because when I just wrote on mine, where are we teaching ethics? It's not a bad
It's a
goal.
holdover. There's no edit there, so.
Oh, it was here already.
Yeah.
And piggybacking on Deborah too, there is another place where we talk about ethics and morals. So you like your intellectual issues. I circled that because I think ethics and morals are different and one is a much more fraught term and do we want them both in there?
Because I think this document is to address behaviors that affect other students negatively, or that affect students negatively. Ethics is a subsection of that. We really need to talk about behaviors.
I think the only other place in the document where we talk about ethics is under the plagiarism and the cheating. We don't talk about it anywhere else.
Okay, so on page 4, we group harassment and bullying together, but throughout the document, we talk about harassment, but not bullying. So if we're going to put them together in a definition, then I think we should be consistent throughout the document. And wherever we say harassment, we say and/or bullying, because unless we're going to separate them in the definition, we just need to carry through and, because not all harassment could be bullying, and I don't know if the transition, I don't know if all bullying is harassment or all harassment is bullying or not, but I think we just need to be very clear about that, so just nobody has any ambiguity about it. On page 8,
Deb,
yes,
so I have to leave in like 2 minutes, and I want to hear Sandra's comments, and it sounds like these are like more line editing.
okay, then I can come back if you have to leave, but I do
Okay.
have some other comments that I think
Are they more globally?
Mhm.
Let's do the global ones and then we'll go to
Well, I'm just trying not to lose my
The clock
place.
is ticking.
On page 8, number 8, dress appropriately for school and school functions, I just don't know what that means.
You and me both.
And on page 9, so the bigger thing for me, where we talk about essential partners. Number 1, I don't see anything in here that addresses when teachers or staff violates the code of conduct. It talks about what's expected of teachers, but what happens when they're the ones bullying, or they're the ones with the microaggression? I'm not saying we necessarily have it in the district, but if we do, that somehow needs to be addressed here, because we talk about what's expected of the teachers and the staff, but we don't say, okay, what happens if what they're expected to do isn't what's happening.
Does that belong in this document, or is that a personnel?
Can we leave it as a dot open question, since we only have a few minutes, because I think it's interesting, but it's not a 30-second discussion.
I will also say that, and I'll get to my final point and then send you go. It's great to define the behaviors that are not appropriate, and it's great to define what happens to the students who are not acting appropriately, but in the middle there is a very important step that I think is not being given enough attention in this document, and that is, how do we get from the action that's happening to the discipline? Something has to be reported, and this document is too weak on the reporting part of it. It talks about, so students are required to report. So on page 24, it says, all students and staff are required to promptly report. It doesn't say to whom, it doesn't say how, it doesn't say when, it doesn't say anything about parents, it doesn't say anything about the chain of command. to me, the most important thing to get the ball rolling, because the behaviors are going to happen, but it has to be, before we get to that point, God forbid, in the time for gets to suicide, there has to be an emphasis on making the district, the appropriate district personnel aware. And if a student doesn't feel comfortable telling the parent, there has to be something in here that makes sure that reporting happens, and it happens in a timely manner, and the process and the procedure, because is it reported? Is it your building principal? Is it your favorite teacher? Is it the health teacher?
I think there is a mention of if, that they are supposed to do it in person or through reported, but I see your point. So we're just making with the list.
Because it's not
Let's
under
go to Sandra's comment, please.
So, Deborah,
Please go to Sandra's comment.
do you have more on your?
I can wait.
Okay.
I can do my quick one that would be important before you leave. So I have many community comments, I know the time, so the more important one is you have to leave. I really would hope that you relook at your own thought process when it comes to code of conduct for the dress code. For the dress code, and what I said with Dr. Pernick when I met with him, the reason this was under review, under my eyes, not only is it annually supposed to be reviewed by the Board of Ed, it is in your 5-year plan, and it's specified that this be reviewed by the committee, the 4 members that you listed, and that be brought to you guys by May. So the timing of this was listed in your plan with NYU on a DEI level. And the reason being that code of conduct traditionally have been used against marginalized groups. While I understand the importance of reviewing artificial intelligence, all those items, the importance of this review was highlighted because of its use against marginalized groups. When your comments of dress code were made, professionalism, attire, those are all terminologies that have been used against marginalized groups. Mark Zuckerberg wears flip-flops. As professional as you can get. So for this district, you have all different levels of socioeconomic and diversity. There are children in your district who have one pair of shoes. If that shoe's unavailable, they're wearing the flip-flops. And I don't mean to get upset because I'm thinking about it and I'm trying to be professional about it, but there are kids who wear bathing suits because they have for shorts. So, just when you talk about professionalism, you were in sneakers today, right? The 2 professionals here are in their suits. There are students who don't have the suits. There are fundraisers for suits for students in this own district. So I apologize because my own son came to me with one shoe and just the fact that that's the focus. Sorry, that's it.
Sandra, I
Thank you,
think,
Sandra.
I want to add one more note that she just made me think of something else for you to think about. In our code of conduct level dress code discussion, we do have dress code requirements for certain school events, notably concerts and things like that. And one of the things that I think many parents have observed for years is that can be onerous for some families. White shirt, black pants seems simple until you have to go out and buy a white shirt and a pair of black pants, and suddenly the concert's a big expense. But the bigger problem, I think, or the more expensive problem for people is the footwear requirement. Because there is a footwear requirement in those dress codes. While we're trying to be equitable, is that something that we should be addressing at this level? That there should be sensitivity to different socioeconomic statuses when you're making those decisions?
I think there is potentially some place to put in there. It would not be at that level of specificity. I do think, though, that we need to open our eyes at things like music performances and work on the assumption that every child can afford, that every child has. The one that happened most recently was not providing a bus to get to Tillis. and we had children that couldn't get there. And that is a blind spot, right? There is an assumption that is built in that students who play an instrument are all have enough means or have parents who can get them there. And so I think that's a global issue for us to look at as to breaking apart from that assumption. But in the code, I think we might want to speak, we can add a line is where I think we end up doing.
I think that's right, like, the line, it's setting a different expectation. What happens with the Tillis Center?
I'll be honest with you, I don't know about this after the fact.
I mean, I think that we have parent groups that work really hard to fill in all these gaps, right? And do drives for the right clothing to pass them on and,
I
you
agree.
know, all the supplies, but you're right, as a district, we need to.
So we rely on generosity all the
That, it
time.
needs to be systematized.
That's the issue.
Right, it has to be,
Everything
it has
is always
to be
about the system.
institutionalized.
Yep.
And we shouldn't force people into
Yep.
relying on charity when they don't really need charity, they just need us. Right, it's not charity for us, we provide buses for a team together, like for example.
Well, I mean, the Tillis Center in particular was funded by a grant.
Yeah.
Because we thought that was, obviously, the grant donors thought this was a worthy opportunity to fund, it should be available for all students then.
Yeah.
But you're right, is any of that being thought about or addressed through the NYU work already?
That's where it came from. And this is, I mean, I would also underscore, people want to know how important this work is. It's in those sessions that things like this get surfaced, along with dozens and dozens and dozens of other blind spots. Again, none of this is with intentional intent to harm. So that work and then how we address it is critical. It's, I don't know how else to explain it, it's critical. Because it provides a venue where it's safe to bring those things up and express concern and then work on, okay, how do we build a process where we can remedy?
I agree with you, with your use of the word blind spot, right? You know,
It's a constant learning.
I mean, it's really, it's very similar to, if you think about accessible design, right? We have accessible design now because people who are, you know, fully able-bodied or, you know, whatever we assume the norm will be, don't realize that there are things that are not accessible.
You know, this is why, what comes to mind is there are lots of, I mean, how are the terms that we've used, like paper cuts? Paper cut is no big deal, but if you have 1,000 of them, it's gonna be pretty hard to get you to stop bleeding. And so we view them as paper cut, but if you're on the receiving end, and you're on the receiving end over and over and over again by your school district, so the way you experience it is huge. It's exactly why Sandra is feeling the way that she's feeling. There's just too much of it. So yes, I agree, the bus thing is a blind spot that we can correct.
And a child shouldn't be in a position of saying, I don't have sheets for that, right? Like, it should be, the onus should be on the district itself to understand that that's a possibility and make it so that it's not an awkward situation, because really, like, who cares what color shoes are for a concert, right?
Can I ask from a process standpoint, where would you like us to go from here? But we've done a lot of great work today, we really have. And I think it's a real opportunity for us to continue to work on the draft.
Right.
And I'm sure there's other comments that we haven't even gotten to yet.
So I'm gonna push it back on you for a second.
Yeah.
I guess, what do you think would be helpful here? Because I think that we got a lot done. I don't wanna waste time or make you sit in a committee meeting again if it's not productive. But I know Nan probably has more, I have more, Emily has more, the board as a whole should probably discuss at some point.
So can I make a suggestion for that? I think in light of what you just said, and which is 100% true, and all the work that has already been done, perhaps we can ask the entire board, which I know it was included, the code of conduct, but to actually make their red line comments or changes or whatnot, and maybe you kind of condense it, because I don't think,
So
I think what I wouldn't want is the administrative team to go back and do some work, more work, and then have it be undone.
So
That's my concern.
I'm not sure you want 7 red lines. So I kind of, I'll ask Nan what she thinks too, but I kind of think that we gave you a lot. Maybe we should have a general conversation at the board meeting about the code of conduct to get more input in. But I think that we could also have another committee meeting and talk about it again. Like, what do you think is most effective and most helpful?
So I think things like grammatical corrections, for example, those could easily be forwarded to Dr.
Yeah.
Carney. But I think there's been a lot of work done today that Dr. Carney can create input for the current document.
Right.
So I think, yes, bringing it back to this committee is a natural place for it to return to.
Okay.
I think our goal is still to have it in place by September. No matter how many edits we do between now and then, I think it's important that we are ready to move forward with it in September. So I think coming back to this committee next month is probably a good next step. Doesn't mean it'll be complete, but we want to keep striving towards that completion for this version, not
Okay.
So do you want our 3 red lines then, if
I think that's helpful, and I think if any of the other board members have other pieces to share with you, if we could funnel it through the committee chair, that would probably be helpful. So there's
That's great.
not so many different copies out there.
That's great. And then maybe the next, so June is another conversation,
Yes.
and also any board members can come. Is that timing work for you?
That's fine, I have, the editing pieces are, and the consistency pieces and the questions about tone, those are easy to address, right? That's me probably going through the document.
Sorry.
That's what we
okay.
need together, collaborate.
So I know we have to end. Obviously, we're not doing social media, right? Should we bump that to June? We also discussed, and I think want to add the class size policy to June as well, with the knowledge that we may have stuff from June too. If we're on this.
we're not getting.
What else is on our June agenda? Are there more updates?
Tony has that list, she keeps it all for us very accurately.
So we had the private tutoring / the commercial solicitation, so policy 4134. We had policy 4531, field trips and excursions. And now social media was put back on June. So we had
Okay.
those 3 pending policies, and there's one more annual review that I can't remember off the top of my head.
Okay. Private tutoring is a checking back in after
Yes.
administration discussion.
They both are, those first 2, if I remember correctly.
Yes, there were
Yeah.
data questions and language questions that were directed to specifics that Dr. Shields is speaking on.
Okay, all right, so those at least are not huge, although class size might be a bulky discussion, so maybe we put it on for June and we know that we'll bump it if we need to, right? Okay, thank you, everyone. If anybody watching or here has any further comments, feel free to email the whole Board of Ed, boe@portnet.org. And we'll get the comments back and we'll discuss again next time. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for your
Thank you for all
conversation.
the work. Thank you.
Okay, turn it over to Rachel.